One would think that after being invaded by a hostile alien force, the first thing people would do after the victory would be to capture the material, capture the enemy personnel, take care of our own wounded and dead, and then get ready for the next invasion, or get ready to reach out to fight them on their own terms. Well, that is what we normally would do. What turned out to happen was that somehow, whatever type of magical burst that came across the planet that created all those fissures, where energy reached out and grabbed onto every single living thing on this planet, it changed not only humans, but also animals. It turns out that St. Bernard is now Cerberus, and is very, very mean. All three-headed dogs are. Not only that, but around the planet, all different things became exceedingly difficult to deal with, and others were just a mild annoyance. Things like in Scotland with the Freys. Once you found out the Freys' territory and knew to leave them the hell alone, they would just leave you alone. Freys are extremely territorial that way. The same thing with trolls and ogres and things of that nature up in Scandinavia. However, when you start reaching across into like the Middle East, it gets weird, as tales of beautiful women walking across the desert by themselves came into being. I knew instantly what this was. They were ghouls. Ghouls are simply women who were usually sexually assaulted and then murdered. They would simply roam the desert finding stray men, offering them intimate encounters, and as they started to enjoy themselves, the ghouls would simply rip out their throat and consume them. Then you head over towards the east, where things like nine-tailed foxes were now semi-common, and things of that nature. Other yokai just seemed to show up out of nowhere. Since I'm not from that area, I have a lot of trouble wrapping my head around it, but it was bad enough in the US. You had things like werewolf, Sasquatch, what they call that in Mexico, the demon dog they got down there, all these different things we had to deal with. And at first, it looked like we were simply going to be overrun. Reason being is that they came at us full force, and we were not prepared for them at all. Only a few people who were dabbling in the mystic arts knew what to do when faced with any of these creatures, any of these cryptids, any of these whatever in the hell might be coming at you. It didn't matter if it was physical or spiritual or whatever in the hell it was. You had to know how to deal with it. And at first, yes, they took us by surprise, and yes, they started to tear our populations apart. But back in the day, the most they had to deal with was sword, spear, and shield, and now they have to deal with silver ball bearings, salt rounds from the shotguns, and anything else science has created in the past 1,000 years. And they did not last long. In eventuality, we pushed them back to their own borders, and they were no longer much of a threat. And once everyone became aware of them, something as simple as the lamias around the forest, everyone knew what to watch out for and to be careful, and to take them down on sight. However, because these cryptids, these creatures, these concoctions of whatever creation made them, we started to make allies with them. We let them know that our entire planet was under attack, and this would mean them as well. So they decided to listen, and listen well. They decided they would fight alongside us if it meant the survival of their kind. And with our numbers dwindling, we realized that this was our best chance of winning everything back. It would take a long time before the alien technology was repurposed for our own uses. Reverse engineering seems like a simple task of taking something apart to see how it works, but when you're working with spiritual energy, things get a little weird. In that case, it is more like quantum physics, and as one would put it, if you're not confused about quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics, and it's the same when it comes to magical abilities. However, it did enlighten a lot of our scientists into how those engines actually operate using science alone. and it wasn't long before they realized the reason why we had such an easy time taking down their ship was because their energy reserve was very limited. As it turns out, they had to store as much energy as possible before the ship even left its planet. Once they were able to access the logs, it was very easy to simply read that they had increased the amount of energy inside its reserves to the point of maximum capacity, and then use that to travel the stars. This allowed them to do many things, to include jump to different sectors. However, when the ship was on the surface, they were worried that they would run their reserves dry if they tried to fight and leave at the same time. This is why they used that burst as a warning, at least they thought it was a warning, as they tried to knock our aircraft out of the sky. Then they tried to lift off and not shoot back. We noticed on the recordings that whenever the ship powered up its engines, the weapons shut off. This was to assure that they had enough engine to not only clear the planet, but also to jump back to their own space. This is why our aircraft and artillery were able to punch down in through the armor, because it was not firing back and could not deflect anything. They did try, God help them they tried, but it wasn't enough. One of our simple bunker busters was enough to make that ship unusable forever. And where it was sitting, it was eventually dismantled in place, being as large as it was. However, during those several months and several years that continued to pass by afterwards, the fear that they would return with a much larger armada and simply glass the planet was a contentious subject, to say the least. And with that, every single government across the planet decided to build their own fleets, not really working together per se. They did share some information technology. However, it was clear that governments hide the best technology for themselves. I wasn't complaining. I was just glad that my own family was safe. Though while the governments of the world still worried about what was going to happen, most everyone focused on what was around them and also what was now in them. It was pretty clear once I reviewed the CCTV footage that when I had pointed my hand at the dog, there was some sort of energy that went out, as my hand seemed to blur in the video. I began to work with it, trying to find any type of text I could to try and learn anything about it. And eventually I discovered how to use this ability. And yes, it was sorcery. There is no way around it. Even though in some cases it seemed like telekinesis, there were things that just could not be explained through that. For example, with a little bit of training, I could simply reach out and have my coffee cup come to my hand, and then focusing, I could make it boil, which was really nice if I had forgotten to drink the coffee before it went cold. However, I found that a friend of mine who was British really loved the fact that he could boil water in his hand so that he could make his tea. The little things. You have to enjoy the little things. While figuring things out, though, I got a call as they wanted me to come back to active duty service. Since they had told me that I had to retire at a certain point, I didn't have a choice. I was beyond hesitant to say that I would join them. Eventually, they did send someone to my house and inform me that since I was obviously strong in magic, that I would have to come back and join them. I told them I didn't have to do anything. They were not exactly thrilled with this, but there's not much they could do, as I had the power at that point to quite literally eviscerate someone with just a flick of my hand. However, my killing days are over, and that's what I told them. I was in the shooting war, and I was one of the men that went and did the shooting. I'm done. If anything, you bring me some wounded and I'll help them out, but that's it. Of course, they perked up and said, well, you can be one of our docs. So I'm already learning how to do that. What they didn't know, if they had done a little bit more research, is that I had gone down to the local hospital, and I was not the only one. As it turned out, most magic wielders decided to use their abilities not for destruction, but for either construction or reconstruction. As in, they would either use their abilities to help build buildings or cars or what have you, or they would use them to put people back together. This was an incredibly useful skill, and I worked beside surgeons for years on this, as they taught me as much as possible. However, I would not make anything official, and most people didn't. This is the reason because, well, most people just do not trust the governments anymore. They are hiding whatever tech they're getting from the elves that drop by. But pretty soon we wouldn't have a choice in the matter, as it wasn't the elves that stopped by to say hello this time. This time, as we looked to the stars to see large ships coming down, and these ships were not simply transport craft. No, these things clearly were made for war. Warbirds that were simply glistening with weapons from one side to the other, up, down, left, and right. And as they came through the atmosphere, no one could get close as they began to fire on anything that came close. No word was given except for one word to us: surrender. Our response was simple. At least in this area of the world, it was a good old American fuck you. And we began to fire everything we could at it. Even if we couldn't reach it with our artillery cannons, we sent all sorts of guided munitions into it. Several bunker busters were able to be dropped onto this thing from a higher altitude as it tried to get close enough to glass entire cities. And it did not take long before another few of these ships were plummeting to the surface, unable to stay afloat as they were coming apart at the seams from the sudden burst of munitions. It wasn't just in the U.S., but around the world, all the nations had fired everything into the sky without hesitation to take down these warbirds. As these giant ships crashed and eventually slid to a stop, we could see that what came out of them was not elves. Oh, no. These were massive ogres. Different types in different areas came out. It didn't matter what area of the world it was. There was a style of ogre that came out. Yes, there was the massive, fat, pig-looking ones. There was the giant, muscular ones. There was all the different ones. And there was even females in that mix as they came out with giant weapons of war, mostly melee weapons. However, they did not expect us to be able to treat them in kind. It wouldn't matter how big they were, or how many weapons they carried, how nasty they looked, how disgusting they looked, or how mean they acted. They all fell prey to our heavy munitions. The 50 caliber machine gun cut through them like butter, the first wave being chopped down without much of a problem as the first Humvee just opened up on whatever evading army it was, pushing them back very quickly to their own ships. Using their ship's main weapons, they tried to fire back at us. However, to their complete and utter dismay, we had recommissioned our battleships. The Missouri turned its guns as soon as it got within range and began to fire. It wouldn't matter how strong the hull was. Those 16-inch guns came down and brought all sorts of hell on top of the ships. And it wasn't long until those big ogres decided to make one mad dash out into the woods to try an assault. But they made a massive mistake around me as they came towards my family. And they do not do that. One of them saw my niece, the one had been transformed, and grabbed her and tried to pick her up. She clawed and thrashed around, and he gave a grin. And he said something I couldn't hear, but then he licked his lips as I turned the corner to see this. And the last thing he saw was my face in sheer rage as I darted towards him, swelled up energy and sent it his way, tearing his body into pieces as it flew backwards the other direction. I used my other senses to try and hold my niece into place. Unfortunately, she still landed on the ground with a bit of a thud, but otherwise unharmed. The ogre stood there, looked at me, tried to raise some sort of weird battle axe that it activated, and it began to glow. I could feel energy coming out of it, but energy I didn't know beyond electricity. What the hell was this? I wasn't going to let it get close, and I simply raised a manhole cover and used it to clobber the guy over the back of the head. It staggered for a moment, and then using my powers again, I raised the manhole cover up and crushed his head right into the fucking ground. All I could think is, damn it. I thought my killing days were over. What the hell? I went to my niece and I checked her. She was okay. I told her to run back to her sister. Her sister had somehow begun to conjure some sort of spell and actually launched it over behind my back. I was like, what? As I turned, I realized that she had not gone without powers. It was just taking her longer because she was so young. In fact, that one bolt that seemed like a condensed lightning pulse that came out of her hand was enough to make her dizzy and drop to one knee. Looks like someone needs some training. That being said, the battle was over within 48 hours. Those captured were shown on TV and on the internet, and sure enough, they all looked like the ogres we thought they would be. Every single one of them, no matter what style it was, had the telltale tusks coming out. Male or female, it doesn't matter. At one point, you could see that they were trying to segregate the males and the females seemed scared. And it occurred to me right away what was going on, why they were so frightened at the idea of being separated from the males. They believed as they were led away in chains that they were being led to slavery, and we all know what happens to female slaves. It was not as bad as they thought when they entered the detainee camps, the ones that were hastily set up, or jails that were quickly evacuated so that the ogres could be brought in. They were then given their provisions and their beds. I can only imagine how difficult it would be for them to sleep on the beds, given the size of these things, standing at least 7 or 8 feet tall. But I'm sure they may do. It's better than the alternative. And with the introduction of these new wrecked ships, with the new reverse technology that was coming out, we could only imagine what those 30-pound brain motherfuckers were going to do with this type of technology. And what they did absolutely astounded us. Within just a few years, they had already come up with a small patrol craft that could actually reach beyond our atmosphere. This thing was run completely science-based. It had no magic on it at all. However, a single magic wielder, a sorcerer like myself, could simply overpower the weapons and engines and make them work at a level that not ever seen before. I thought about joining back up at that point. I didn't know. All I knew is that humanity was now beyond our own cradle, and it wouldn't take long before several more ships were being made. Each of the governments began to make their own ships. The larger the industrial base of their continent or their country was enough that they made larger and larger ships and more powerful. A true space race had begun outside of Earth, and we could thank those fantasy creatures that had come to our planet to try and take us, to rule us, as the elves came and tried to subjugate us through their own pride, and the ogres had tried to take us through their sheer wrath. We wondered what else could be out in the stars, but we couldn't just sit here and wait. We had no idea what may be coming next or when, and we had to be ready. But this time, we would choose the battlefield. Humanity would no longer sit on the sidelines and wait to be shot at, wait to be invaded. We reached out to our friends, the new cryptids, the new creatures that were out there, those that were formed from human and those that had come back from the ether, and they joined us. We all came together in our own tribes, our own clans, our own countries, our own nations, our own civilizations, and we all brought together our resources, our knowledge, and we got ready for what was coming. We knew the galactic community saw us as a target. They saw us as easy prey. Well, they will soon find out that humanity is not easy prey. Humanity will resist and bite back.